Hello everyone, this is Mr. Baxley, and this is going to be the last video of the semester for Como-Pickton US History classes. Both the college class and the regular US History class is going to be watching this video, hopefully, and we are going to wrap up our content for the year. I want to start off by saying thank you to everyone for working so hard and for having so much patience with this new way of teaching. Hopefully we'll never have to do it again, but it has been an interesting experience, and I'm grateful for everyone and their hard work. So, last video we talked about the 1980s and Ronald Reagan, the end of the Cold War, and we ended off on the thought of what do we do now? What will America do now that our old enemy, the Soviet Union, is gone? For about 45 years, we grappled with the Soviet Union over control over the world. But now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, in the 1990s, America has to figure out what their role will be in the world. In many ways, the United States takes the role of being protector of freedom and the leader of the world. But with that responsibility, what do we do? What do you do when you're Superman? When you have all the power in the world, is it your responsibility to act? Is it your responsibility to solve the world's problems for them? If you're the most powerful country in the world, what is your obligation? What should you do? Those are the questions that the United States has to answer. It's a new world order. With the Cold War over, the United States decided they wanted to create a world based on democracy, free market capitalism, and Western culture. We want to spread our ideas and our values all across the world. But just because the Cold War is over doesn't mean that war is over. It doesn't mean that problems are over. The 1990s sees a rise of challenges for the United States at home and abroad. We see terrorism, ethnic strife in Europe and in the Middle East. And the United States has the obligation that we put upon ourselves to be the peacekeeper of the world. Again, if you're Superman and there's a kitten falling off out of a tree, is it your duty to save it? If you have the ability to save someone's life and you don't, are you a murderer? Those are the questions the United States deals with. If we have the strength to solve other people's problems for them, is it wrong for us to not solve them? Or is it the right thing to do for us to be the policeman of the world, the superhero for the world? And what if the world doesn't want us to be their police officer? These are a lot of questions the United States has to deal with. And when we're no longer faced with, and while we're dealing with this problem, even though we don't have the Soviet Union around, we still have reasons to be angry with ourselves. The 1990s sees an increase in partisanship, which is the divide between the political parties. The conservatives and the liberals, the Republicans and the Democrats grow more and more apart ideologically and become much more combative in their arguments with each other. At the same time, the 1990s sees a growth in communications technology and an increasingly interconnected world with a lot of cultural diffusion as the United States culture spreads to the rest of the world and as other cultures spread to the United States. Now, right after Ronald Reagan's presidency, George H.W. Bush becomes president. There are two George Bushes that were president of the United States. They're father and son. This is George H.W. Bush, the older one, the father, and George W. Bush is his son who became president later. Okay, so our 41st president was George H.W. Bush, and our 43rd president was his son, George W. Ronald Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, runs for president in 1988 and wins, largely on the reputation of Ronald Reagan. He basically promises to be Ronald Reagan Part 2, the sequel, and he wins. And one of his biggest challenges as president is dealing with this role of being the superpower. You see, the Soviet Union is no longer our biggest concern. And so the United States starts paying attention more closely to other parts of the world, like the Middle East. In August of 1990, the dictator of Iraq Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion of a smaller country neighboring Iraq called Kuwait. You see, Iraq claimed Kuwait to be part of Iraq. Kuwait claimed to be an independent country. Iraq invades Kuwait, and it's like a David and Goliath situation, but this time David did not have the blessing of the Lord. Like, anyway, listen, maybe that's not the best metaphor. Basically, Iraq bullies Kuwait very badly, and they take them down, okay? Kuwait falls very quickly, and the United States is very upset, which is interesting because Iraq had been our ally. Back in the 1980s, when we were very concerned about the Soviet Union, Iraq was considered to be one of our allies, and we gave Iraq a lot of weapons. We had equipped Iraq with a massive army, and they happened to be one of the largest militaries in the world, not bigger than the United States, but one of the more significant military powers of the world was Iraq. And Kuwait was a major supplier of oil to the United States. Many people saw Saddam Hussein's invasion as step one of a big plan to control all of Saudi Arabia and the world's oil supply. There is a lot of oil right around the Persian Gulf, and this is why the war is called the Persian Gulf War. Many people thought that Saddam Hussein's master plan was to basically take control of the world's oil supply and hold the world hostage. So the United States and the United Nations do not like this. We send over 500,000 American soldiers to Saudi Arabia, which borders Iraq and Kuwait, in an operation called Operation Desert Shield. This was step one of the war. The first step was defending Saudi Arabia because we thought that Iraq was going to attack Saudi Arabia. The Soviet Union is in the middle of its collapse in 1990, and so they don't do anything to oppose the U.S. plan, so we focus on this. We send an ultimatum to Iraq. That's a little typo there, sorry. We send an ultimatum to Iraq. We tell them that they need to get out of Kuwait by February 15, 1991, or they will face a full-scale attack. We tell them, if you do not get out of Kuwait, we are going to attack you. And that's what we do. Iraq refuses to leave, or January 15th, not February. I'm sorry, that was covered up. But January 15th, Iraqis do not leave Kuwait. And so that night, Operation Desert Storm begins. The United States starts off by bombing Iraq for several weeks. American airplanes gain air superiority over Iraq, and we start bombing the snot out of them. We often sent over 2,500 missions per day into Iraq to soften up the land so that we could attack with our land forces. Iraq responded with missiles called Scud missiles that they launched at Saudi Arabia and Israel. Now, these Scud missiles were very scary to American soldiers because Iraq had access to chemical weapons. They had not used them a lot, but they did have them, and they had used them on their own people, the Kurds. And these chemical weapons, it brought back memories of World War I, back whenever gas attacks killed thousands and thousands of soldiers. And the gases were more deadly and more powerful now in 1990 than they were back in the 19-teens. So the United States soldiers often had to wear very heavy protective gear that they would wear to protect themselves from chemical attack. And this is in the desert of Saudi Arabia. It might be over 100 degrees hot in the middle of the day. And they'd have to wear these full, it's like this rubber. I'll show a picture. I got it right here. This full rubber protective suits in the heat of the desert. It's awful, awful stuff. Anyways, Iraq actually attacks Israel, and this was an interesting ploy. You see, Israel had been the ally of the United States, and Israel was a country that many of the Middle Eastern countries hated. And so Iraq wanted Israel to get in the war because they hoped that if Israel joined the war, then other Arab countries would join on the side of Iraq to fight against Israel. But the rest of the Arab world knows what's going on. They're not fooled by this trick. They know that Iraq's goose is cooked. They picked a fight with the United States. They don't want any part of it. So the rest of the Arab world stays out of it. They oppose Iraq. So after about over a month of air missions, on February 24th, the United States launches the ground war. This is a slam dunk for the U.S. military. We learned our lesson from the Vietnam War. The last major war for the United States before the Persian Gulf War, or the Operation Desert Storm, the last war that we had fought was the Vietnam War, and we lost that one. And we lost that one because, the government was fighting a political war. We stayed in Iraq for a very long time trying to put down this rebellion, and we didn't send enough soldiers. We had all these problems that happened in the Vietnam War. The public was divided. And so George H.W. Bush knows that this war cannot be a long one. He does not want a long war in Iraq. He wants a fast, quick war before public support goes away. And he wants a fast, quick war that overwhelms the enemy. And so the tactic of the Persian Gulf War is overwhelming superiority. We just flood the area with soldiers, and within 100 hours, Iraqi forces are driven from Kuwait. Then we start invading Iraq, and as Iraq is leaving Kuwait, they demolish oil wells. So they start sabotaging the oil in Kuwait as kind of like a last, take this, United States. And the United States basically conquers all of Iraq very quickly. And so George H.W. Bush has to make a decision. Now that we've defeated Iraq, do we get rid of Saddam Hussein, the dictator, or do we leave him in power? The United States decides to leave Saddam Hussein in power because even though he was a dictator and he was a very bad guy, at the time we thought that it would be better to leave Saddam Hussein in charge because he kept Iraq stable. And we wanted a stable government of Iraq because if you get rid of Saddam Hussein, who's in charge? And even though Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, we at least knew who he was and how to deal with him. And the fear of the unknown of what would happen if we got rid of him was scary. And we didn't want to stay in Iraq for years and years and try to rebuild the country back in 1990. It would be George H.W. Bush's son who would stay in Iraq for years and years and years and take out Saddam Hussein and try to change up the country, which is an interesting little, wrinkle in American history. A father and son presidents, the first one invaded Iraq and his son invaded Iraq too. So interesting coincidence. When it comes to the casualties, nearly 35,000 Iraqis are killed, over 75,000 are wounded. The Iraqis lose thousands of tanks, artillery, and vehicles, hundreds of airplanes and ships. Meanwhile, the United States coalition suffers 147 killed, and that's just a little bit more than the number that died just from being out in the sun and heat exposure, okay? This is a hot desert war, and you can see right here, here's Iraq, here's Kuwait, here's Israel, and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. forces were based in Saudi Arabia. We then, liberated Kuwait and attacked Iraq. And look at all this oil that was very potentially in the hands of Iraq. So this is an overwhelming victory for the United States, and it makes George H.W. Bush look really popular. So it would seem like it would be really easy for George H.W. Bush to win re-election in 1992. But you'd be wrong. This is also known as the TV war. There was a lot of news coverage of this war, and the United States learned its lessons from the Vietnam War, where we allowed reporters to go. During the Vietnam War, the news coverage of the war really hampered the war effort because newspapers and news television, they would report all the bad things that happened in the war. And they did a lot to really, discredit the government and the government's war effort. And in the Persian Gulf War, we made sure that the cameras made the war look good. We got a lot of these cool action shots where U.S. soldiers are going out and kicking butt and taking names. And in many ways, this was choreographed. And the U.S. military worked actively to make sure that reporters were in the right places so they saw the parts of the war that they wanted it to. And so this war had a lot of support from the government, from the people. This is George H.W. Bush. But George H.W. Bush, even though he seemed untouchable, he was an experienced politician, he was a war hero from World War II, and he was a strong military leader. But At the end of his term, the economy started to slow down and recede, and he had broken a major promise. During his presidential election campaign, George H.W. Bush made a promise where he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." But then he broke his promise and raised taxes. And when you break a promise in politics, it tends to make people upset. And this led to an advantage for a challenger. And that challenger was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was a Democrat. He had been the governor of Arkansas, but he had no experience in the federal government. He had not served in the U.S. military, even though he was of age right around the Vietnam War. And he had never inhaled marijuana. Yes. When asked about it, Bill Clinton admitted to smoking marijuana, but he didn't inhale. What does that mean? I have no idea, but you could ask Bill Clinton, I guess. But that didn't matter because Bill Clinton's slogan was very simple. It's the economy, stupid. That was what he said. He said, I don't care. What do you care about marijuana? You know what this election's about? It's about the economy, stupid. And that phrase, it's the economy, stupid, that focus on changing the economy was very effective. And George Bush also dealt with a problem from a third-party candidate, Ross Perot. You know, you ever heard of the Perot Museum? Ross Perot is this multi-billionaire guy from Texas who he made his own presidential party. He ran for president in 1992, focusing on the national debt. He was actually the most successful third-party nominee ever since Teddy Roosevelt back in 1912. And that's kind of unfair because Teddy Roosevelt had been a president before he ran as a third-party candidate. So Ross Perot is like the closest we've ever had, other than Teddy Roosevelt, to a third party actually winning the president. He actually got 19% of the vote, which is insane. Most of the time, the third parties like the Libertarians, the Green Party, they get less than 5% of the vote in an election. But that 19% is credited by many to dividing Republicans, allowing Bill Clinton to become president with only 43% of the popular vote, while Bush had 38% and Perot had 19%. So here is the 1992 presidential election. Bill Clinton wins, and he's able to get a big electoral advantage because of all the ways that just all the little complicated things that happened, from Bush being unpopular to Perot being involved. Clinton is able to win with a very small percentage of the popular vote, is able to win relatively. He's able to win the whole country very quickly. But Clinton's presidency is kind of a mixed bag, okay? He wins and he opens up his presidency with a more liberal direction, okay? He starts off kind of hardcore liberal with a big plan to overhaul healthcare. He wants to fix the problems of high cost for medical insurance that had led to over 20 million Americans not having coverage. His wife, the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, led a committee, and she was a very active First Lady, and she created a plan to limit costs and insure each citizen of the United States. However, this plan was very controversial. People didn't like it, and it was branded Hillary Care. And many people thought of it as socialism. They said this is socialized medical care. The government should not be running the healthcare system. And so Reagan-style conservatives left, from the 1980s were able to defeat this bill, even though the Democrats controlled Congress. The Democrats had the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency, and they were not able to get this bill passed. But the way our elections work is every 4 years we vote for president, but every 2 years we vote for our Congress. We vote for our whole House of Representatives, and 1/3 of the Senate is usually up for re-election every 2 years. So in 1994, Republicans take back control over Congress. What they argue in the 1994 midterm elections is that the liberals have gone too far, and they formed something called a contract with America. It was a list of 10 promises that the Republicans would pursue if they won. They basically said, if you vote for Republicans, here's the 10 things we will do to change the United States. And this strategy works, okay? A lot of Americans want to go back to that Reagan-style conservatism. They don't like the liberal direction of Bill Clinton, and they want more conservatism. So the Republicans gained control of the Senate and the House of Representatives for the first time since 1954, and this effort was led by Newt Gingrich, who became the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the de facto leader of the Republican Party throughout the rest of pretty much all of Bill Clinton's career as president. Clinton pledged to try to work with the opposition-controlled Congress, and this led to an interesting situation. You have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. They have differing ideas, and they have to figure out how to work together. And it actually leads to a change in our budget that actually kind of worked. It was interesting. You see, Republicans tend to want to cut taxes and cut spending. They want to reduce the amount of money the United States is collecting in taxes, and they want to reduce the amount of money the United States is spending in programs. Democrats tend to be the opposite. They want to increase spending for government programs like Social Security, healthcare programs, things like that, while increasing taxes, typically on the rich, to pay for it. The compromise that they end up getting is a reduction in government spending and kind of an increase in taxes and a reduction in, it leads to the government spending less money and increasing taxes, which leads to a budget surplus, which is nuts. Since the New Deal, from the New Deal in the 1930s until the 1990s, for about 60 years, the United States ran a deficit. That means that we took in less money in taxes than we spent in programs that we spend the government. When you have a deficit, that builds a debt. That's money that you owe that you're supposed to pay back. But in the 1990s, we actually made money. Our government actually was able to pay off a little bit of our debt, which is something that had not happened for 60 years, and it really hasn't happened since. Right now, and the way the country's going right now, we are spending trillions of dollars on stimulus spending due to the virus and things like that, and that's leading to a massive deficit. But back in the 1990s, we actually were able to pay off a little bit of our debt. And this led to Bill Clinton becoming popular again. And so even though in 1994, the Republicans gained control of Congress, in 1996, the Democratic candidate for the president, Bill Clinton, wins a second term. And so Bill Clinton has 2 terms as presidency. But then in 1998, he nearly loses his presidency due to a scandal. Okay? Back during his first term, it was reported that Clinton had engaged in a sexual affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. He was asked about this under oath, where people swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And Bill Clinton denied the affair, but evidence was found proving that the affair was true, that it had happened, and it even happened in the Oval Office, like the president's office. This affair had happened. And so outraged Republicans demand that Clinton be impeached, and the voting followed party lines. Democrats said, it's not that big of a deal. He should still be president. Republicans say, this is a horrible deal. He should be removed. And so Republicans managed to impeach the president in the House of Representatives. But in the Senate, you need 2/3 majority to remove someone from office. So let's talk about impeachment again. We've talked about it before, but the way impeachment works, we've had 3 presidents be impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. But impeachment does not mean a president is removed. Impeachment means that a president has been formally accused of wrongdoing. You say, bad president. Don't do that no more. That's impeachment, okay? The House of Representatives votes to impeach a president, to say, you have been a bad president. Then it goes to the Senate, and they have a trial. And in that trial, the Senate votes to get rid of the president or to keep him. In Andrew Johnson's case, he was 1 vote away from being removed right after the Civil War, but he managed to stay as president. Bill Clinton, the voting followed party lines. All the Republicans voted to keep him, or to get rid of him. All the Democrats voted to keep him. And so the Democrats were able to keep Bill Clinton in charge. And with Donald Trump, the same sort of thing happened. All the Democrats in the House voted against him pretty much. All the Republicans voted for him. So he got impeached. But then when it came to the Senate trial, the Republicans had a majority of votes, and they were able to vote to keep him in power. Even though one Republican senator, Mitt Romney, did vote against Trump, there was nowhere near enough votes for him to be removed. So in the history of impeachment, most of the presidents that have been impeached, it seems to be very political. It was designed to get rid of presidents who committed high crimes and misdemeanors. But most of the time when you look at impeachment, it's mainly Republicans trying to get rid of a Democrat or Democrats trying to get rid of Republicans, and they're just looking for that gotcha moment. Bill Clinton had an affair. Gotcha. Oh, the Ukraine thing. Gotcha. Okay. Rather than actually trying to get rid of a president who committed crimes. The one president who probably would have been removed was Richard Nixon. And they started the process of impeaching him, but he resigned before he even had a chance to get impeached. So with this, Bill Clinton's presidency is kind of mixed. He has a fairly good record on the economy, but as far as his domestic programs, he didn't really get everything that he wanted, and the impeachment really has marred his legacy in some ways. Here's Bill Clinton being impeached. He was urged to resign, but he vowed to do his job. And Hillary Clinton stayed beside him throughout it all. And later on she ran for president, so we know how that turned out. But that's a little too recent for us to talk about in this class. Now let's talk about the technology, okay? The transformative power of technology continues to be seen even today. But the biggest step in the 1990s is the internet becoming available to private citizens. You see, personal computers had been common since the 1980s, but most personal computers didn't have connection to other computers. Computers were tools, you used them to process information, all sorts of stuff. But the idea that computers would just talk to each other was not something widely known. You might have a local connection, like let's say you work in an office. That office might have a few computers connected that can share with each other. But the idea that I could talk to you across the rest of the world using this computer was not really common until the 1990s. The internet was actually first invented in the 1970s by the US military, and only the military could use it until 1984. But development of fiber optic cables allowed for internet to become faster and easier to do and to build, and it allowed the World Wide Web to be developed by the 1990s. That's why you have www before websites. Now, the way the internet works, kind of complicated, but essentially all the computers in the world that access the internet are connected together, and together they store the information collectively. It's like putting a lot of brains together and sharing the brain power of all the computers to do all sorts of things. Early internet development and early computer technology development was led by entrepreneurs like Bill Gates, and who is the Microsoft founder. He's got gobs and gobs and gobs of money now, and people like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who are really involved in Apple. As the world becomes increasingly connected, you start to see a lot of advantages of the internet. You start to see commerce change. You start to see internet being used to facilitate buying and selling of goods. You start to see people communicating with the internet, like email, chat rooms. Internet is very useful for researchers. People all across the world can use the internet to share information and to grow the knowledge of the United States. And what internet leads to is an exponential increase in technology. It allows for more and more people to share ideas and work together, and it leads to all sorts of innovations. And the pace of technological development skyrockets. And you have more and more and more new tech, faster and faster and faster. Computers become smaller, they become more powerful. Pretty soon we're carrying computers in our pockets, okay? All across the world, the internet affects us even to this day. For example, right now, we're having this crisis, and we are vitally depending upon the internet to keep the world going because of things that you can't, you can't have large groups and that sort of thing. Now, most of the advantages, though, of technology only help those who are financially well off. The United States, Europe, some countries in Asia like Japan, Korea, they get a lot of the advantages of technology that third world countries like Africa, South America, Central America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, they lag behind. And this leads to an increasing gap between the wealthier countries and the third world countries that are not as well off. As the United States approaches the 21st century, as we approach that year 2000, the world becomes increasingly interconnected. We start to see our culture and our economy influence other countries. This is called cultural diffusion. Our influence is spreading. You start to see people in Europe and Asia wearing blue jeans, drinking Coca-Cola, watching Hollywood movies, and eating at McDonald's all across the world. Those are examples of cultural diffusion. As we see more and more interconnection, we start to see more and more trade. Typically, trade is good for world peace. As people trade, they're less likely to go to war. If we're buying and selling stuff in the other country, we're less likely to fight them. Now that the Soviet Union is out of the picture, it's easier for the United States to trade with countries across the Western world. The world isn't divided between communism and capitalism anymore. So the United States is able to trade with just people all across the world. And so we see more and more trade with other countries, and we start to see a decrease in tariffs or taxes on trade. This leads to a growth in the world economy. Whenever you trade, you're typically making more money. It makes sense to trade. The United States should not be building t-shirts and pins and, plastic toys. We should focus on making things that we're better at, like, advanced technology, heavy machinery, airplanes, that sort of thing, and selling that to other countries in exchange for those easier to manufacture things like tennis shoes and t-shirts. And as a result, we benefit and the other countries benefit as well. We make the things we're good at, they make the things they're good at making, we trade with each other, and everybody wins. Free trade benefits the world economy. That may sound like a political position, but I guess that's what I'm taking. But free trade, where it really benefits the United States and benefits everyone, okay? The only consequence that really is kind of negative is that you see jobs start to disappear as you see, say, t-shirt manufacturers in the United States run out of business because places in China can make t-shirts cheaper than us, or stuff like that. So you have some restructuring the economy that hurts a lot of people. But overall, across the whole world, free trade tends to benefit the whole world. Trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which has recently been replaced by the US, Mexico, Canada. I think it's the USMC trade law or something like that was recently replaced just in the last year or two. The NAFTA lowered trade barriers between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, which allowed us to buy and sell stuff with more freedom, and allowed for much more free exchange between Canada, USA, and Mexico. The United Nations and the European Union both represented increased cooperation amongst different countries. The European Union was still exists today. It's an organization of European countries that share the same currency. Typically, they share a lot of the same laws, and they have open and free trade between their borders, and it allows for a lot of economic cooperation. And it's probably a really good thing, because Europe has been the center of some of the last really bad wars in world history. And so anything that makes the people of Europe more friendly to each other is typically a good thing for the United States, even though it does lead to some economic competition between us and the EU. And there's always side effects, but as far as world peace goes, the European Union is a pretty good thing. Yet some people saw the 1990s as a period of decline. Even though we've had all this progress, there are still serious problems with racism, with crime, with sexism. There's a lot of political divisions in the country, economic divisions between the poor and the rich. There's still a lot of environmental concerns. There's a lot of people concerned about things like the theory of global warming, and there's this serious fossil fuel dependence in our economy. So in many ways, as we reach the end of our discussion of U.S. history, a lot of the problems that we've talked about for this whole year still exist today. Today, there is still a conflict over the idea of equality. There's still conflicts over the ideas of freedom. There's still conflicts over the meaning of the federal government in our society. And there's still conflicts over the purpose of the United States as a world power. And there's still conflicts over what is the role of technology, what are the dangers of technology, and the benefits of technology. We're still dealing with these problems even today. So what we're going to do now, this is kind of the end of the more historical analysis. After, when it comes to history, you typically want to let things simmer for a while. You don't want to jump into historically analyzing events that happened just a year ago or even 5 or 10 years ago. Because what historians tend to notice is as we get more historically distant from an event, our ability to analyze it becomes better. It's a lot easier for us to understand the meaning of things that happened in history now that 50 years or 40 years or 100 years has passed, because we have time to see the context. We don't know all the consequences that might happen in the future because of events that are happening right now or just in the past few years. So I'm not going to try to historically analyze the Donald Trump presidency or even a whole lot about Barack Obama's presidency and even a lot of George Bush, because it's just been so recent. We're going to cover a little bit, but there's still so much more that we need to see and get context and to get a little bit of separation for us to be able to have an accurate report of the past. The other problem with doing history that's super recent is talking about stuff that we're politically motivated to talk about. You see, when we talk about political arguments in the 1940s, that happened so long ago, nobody's got a dog in the fight anymore. But today, there are political arguments that are going on that people are voting about that are based off of very recent history. So it's harder for historians to maintain objectivity and to avoid being biased or trying to preach for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party if we're talking about history that's really recent. So I'm going to refrain from doing a lot of that just so that we can maintain some historical integrity. And so what we're instead going to do is just cover some of the basics, and we'll be able to conclude our discussion with that. All right. And if you have more questions, you can ask me an email and I, tell you what I think, but we're going to try to avoid going too far in our history discussion. We're going to skip entrepreneurs. All right. So election 2000. So with that, we're going to cover what happened since 2000. We're going to go to about 2008, 2009, and 2010, and then we're going to stop. Okay, I don't really like doing anything more recent than 10 years. So in 2000, after Bill Clinton is finishing up his second term, his vice president, Al Gore, runs for president against the very popular governor of Texas, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. So this is kind of a rematch in many ways, okay? George H.W. Bush's son versus Bill Clinton's vice president. This is a very, very close election. We're very politically polarized. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party have divided, and they're so angry at each other. It's very evenly matched. The race is too close to call. On election night, nobody knows who the president's going to be. Typically on elections, it's easy to tell. It's like, okay, we don't have all the votes in, but we know how it's going to shake out, and you can know who's going to be the president a lot of times before you go to bed that night, or at the very least you wake up the next morning and you know who wins the presidency. But in 2000, the election dragged on for weeks. And for about a month, nobody knew who was going to be the president, okay? That came down to the vote in Florida. Whoever was going to win Florida was going to be the president. And multiple recounts occurred after George Bush was initially determined to win. You see, what Florida did was something kind of stupid, okay? Today, when you go to vote, there's usually like a machine or a paper ballot, and you either like fill out a Scantron or you push buttons in a machine and record your vote. In Florida, they did this punch card, okay, where you would take a punch, like, have you ever like punched holes in a piece of paper to put in your notebook? Okay, like that. You vote for someone by punching out a hole by the name of that person you wanted to vote for. But if you've ever punched holes in a piece of paper, sometimes that hole is nice and clean, and then sometimes, it doesn't go all the way through, and a little bit of the paper is hanging, and it hasn't been ripped all the way through. That's called a hanging chad. And how Florida counted those became super controversial. It was kind of weird. All over the country, people were arguing about hole punchers and papers. If a hanging chad is like halfway hanging, is that a vote or is that not a vote? If it's just a little bit, is it a vote or is it not a vote? Okay, this is just too much fun. I gotta show you, okay? So look here, hanging Chad. Okay, look here. All right, so see these guys are like staring at these punch cards. Okay, look at this. All right, some of the hanging Chads are like almost all the way out. Some of them are like kind of out. Some of them are. Which one is a vote? Which one is not a vote? How do you count it? They all have to be counted consistently, and it was just awful. Okay, like it was just, you know, it was a big mess. Nobody knew what to do. It actually ends up going to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in the case Bush v. Gore, certifies that the election is complete and that the presidency belongs to George Bush. They stop the recounts. George Bush becomes president. Without winning the popular vote, he wins the electoral vote. George Bush ran as a compassionate conservative. He wanted to do a lot of things to help out the economy, help out the less fortunate. But his presidency very quickly becomes defined by terrorism because on September 11th, 2001, a massive attack on U.S. soil occurs led by a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. Now, this was an absolute tragedy. 2,996 people were killed. More than 6,000 others were wounded as terrorists hijacked commercial airplanes and flew them into buildings like the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon right next to Washington, D.C. Why did they do this? That is a complicated story, but it actually goes back all the way back to this war right here. The Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait mess of the Persian Gulf War. You see, Saudi Arabia is a very important country to Muslims across the world. Saudi Arabia has a city called Mecca, which is the holiest place according to the Muslim religion of Islam. In fact, all of Saudi Arabia is supposed to be like holy land, according to many Muslims. Whenever Saudi Arabia was dealing with Iraq, they let the United States come in and help them fight the Iraqis. Some Muslim groups really took offense to that, including Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. These are Afghanistan soldiers that used to be allies of the United States. If we go back a little bit further, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the United States gave money and weapons to a group called the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen fought against the Russians using American material, American weapons, American money, and they became a pretty tough fighting force. And they wanted to help Saudi Arabia deal with Iraq, but Iraq was such a big threat, Saudi Arabia decided to go with the United States' help instead of the Afghanistan's help, okay? So when American soldiers started staying in the Holy Land to Muslims, this deeply offended the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. And Osama bin Laden demanded that Americans leave this land of Saudi Arabia, and he wanted America completely out of the Middle East. He wanted completely out of all their territory, and he had all sorts of ideas that were really bad for the United States. And obviously the United States refuses, and so the Muslim groups led by Osama bin Laden called Al-Qaeda start doing terrorist attacks. The attack on September 11th was not the first terrorist attack. There were many terrorist attacks before that, but this was the big bad one, okay? Terrorism is the use of fear to achieve your political goals, okay? Rather than, if you can't beat someone in a stand-up fight, if you can't fight a conventional war and you're gonna lose, some groups turn to terrorism. Instead of attacking the military, they attack the civilians, okay? So Al-Qaeda is not strong enough to invade the United States and defeat them. So what they do is they instead try to cause Americans to be afraid. By attacking our civilians, they wanted us to be so afraid that we would give up, that we would leave our positions in the Middle East and do what they told us to do because we were afraid that they would kill more of our civilians. But America does not like to be bullied. And we do not like terrorists. We do not like people who are going to kill innocent civilians, women and children, because of their political motivations, all right? So we do not buckle to this terrorist attack. Rather, we fight back. We do not let the terrorist group Al-Qaeda intimidate us. And so we invade Afghanistan in retaliation, and we begin a 13-year war hunting down all the people in Al-Qaeda. It's not until after George Bush's presidency is over, when Obama is president, that we finally capture and kill Osama bin Laden. But we do get rid of him. And we start a war on terror. We pledge to root out and destroy all supporters of terrorism. And so this becomes our new goal. Remember, back during the Cold War, our goal was to contain the spread of communism. In the war on terror, our goal was to get rid of terrorism. Anyone who is associated with terrorism is an enemy of the United States. So we do everything we can to hunt down terrorists. And this leads to very complicated situations, because when you fight a country, you can declare war on the government. But the terrorists in Afghanistan were not their own country. The government of Afghanistan does not support Al-Qaeda in this way. Okay, typically the governments of these countries that have terrorists in them are separate entities. And so the United States ends up invading countries and attacking places that we're not technically at war with in order to get rid of terrorism. But the reason why we do that is because the terrorists don't play by the rules, okay? They don't respect borders of countries. They don't care that they're in Pakistan or Afghanistan or whatever country they want to be in. They're going to be terrorists no matter where they are. And so the United States pledges to go and find terrorists and kill them wherever we find them. And so it's under this concern that we invade Iraq again, because Saddam Hussein is suspected of supporting terrorists, and the United States suspects that he possesses weapons of mass destruction, like chemical weapons and potentially, theoretically, maybe nuclear weapons, but we're really scared about chemical weapons. And so the United States invades Iraq, beginning an 8-year war from 2003 to 2011. These invasions are successful and not successful. They're successful in taking the fight and killing a lot of terrorists. And we do capture Saddam Hussein, and later on we do kill Osama bin Laden. But these invasions don't find weapons of mass destruction, and they don't create democracies or successful democracies. Our goal in these wars is to take Afghanistan and Iraq and turn them into countries like the United States. Help them have democracy, help them to be countries just like us that have the same values and beliefs. But that's not successful. What ends up happening is that both of those countries get destabilized. And the war, and the lengthy war and occupation by U.S. soldiers, leads to insurgents and people opposing us. And both of these countries kind of turn into Vietnam sequels. It's a very similar situation to the Vietnam War, where we're trying to subjugate a population. We're trying to get people to like us by shooting at them. And it leads to more and more terrorists being created, because every time we kill a terrorist, we kill somebody's dad or somebody's son or somebody's brother or somebody's cousin or uncle or grandpa or whatever. And now we've got a new enemy. And so after the United States leaves Iraq and Afghanistan, we see serious problems like ISIS, the Islamic State, developing in Iraq through all that confusion and chaos that was created in that invasion. Now, that's getting a little recent, and so we don't want to get into too much, but the war on terror is successful in preventing major terrorist attacks from happening in the United States again, but it leads to a lot of problems in the Middle East. At the same time, we start changing our rules for policing. We start infringing in many ways on people's rights to privacy and security, or liberty, in order to prevent more terrorist attacks from happening with things like the Patriot Act and stuff. But the United States deals with terrorism even today. Today, we are still in quasi-military conflicts. We still send drone strikes out to kill people that are suspected of being terrorists. We still send out soldiers to countries. And a lot of times we do it without even the public knowing about it. in order, or the general public really even thinking about it, in order to prevent terrorist attacks from happening. There's no telling how many terrorist attacks have actually been planned and foiled by people like the Central Intelligence Agency or the CIA or the US military that we don't even know actually even happened. Like, it just happened and we didn't even know it. There's no way to know, but it's likely to have happened. So the war on terror defines George Bush's presidency, and it lasts even today in some ways. You could say the war on terror is pretty much over, but it lingered throughout the rest of George Bush's presidency and much of Barack Obama's presidency. Now, there's a huge natural disaster that happens in 2005 called Hurricane Katrina, and this devastates a large portion of the Gulf Coast in the United States, particularly the city of New Orleans. New Orleans is a city that is below sea level, and so there are levees that protected the city from storm surges, but the levees failed in the hurricane, and it floods the city of New Orleans. Hundreds of people die, thousands lose their homes, and millions of people's lives are disrupted and damaged as they're forced to leave as refugees. I remember when I was a kid in school, this happened, and we had new kids show up at school that were from basically refugees from Hurricane Katrina. And they didn't stay for very long, but they were at our school for, about a year or so, and then they were able to go back home or somewhere else. But this was crazy how many people lost their homes and their lives were ruined because for a long time, their lives were really hurt significantly by Hurricane Katrina. And it was really bad, okay? This is the this is where the New Orleans Saints play. I believe it's the Superdome in New Orleans. And it was turned into a refugee camp, okay? This is a football field. And there's just thousands of people just living in squalor as they're waiting on help, okay? George Bush was criticized for not responding quickly enough for most people. A lot of people thought he wasn't very decisive in sending help to New Orleans quickly. And as a result of this, gas prices go up. New Orleans is a major port. It's a port right at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And when you shut down that giant port, it affects the economy considerably. The way gas prices are right now was how things were before Hurricane Katrina were. When I was a kid, I remember prices being a lot lower, and then you have Hurricane Katrina and gas prices started to go up considerably, and they stayed up until this most recent incident that we're dealing with right now. Interesting, we'll see how we talk about history about this era in 20 years. I'll have to add some more slides to the PowerPoint, I guess. Anyways, moving on. Now, the last thing we're really going to talk about is 2008, 2009. This was our last major recession until right now, the economic crisis we're going through right now. And the Great Recession is the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, okay? The Great Recession of 2008, not the Great Recession, is not as bad as the Great Depression of the 30s, 1929 through the 1930s, but this one was pretty bad, okay? What happened is that there was a bubble in the economy. A bubble in the economy is when prices go up and up and up and up and up, and then all of a sudden they just collapse and they fall flat very quickly. And this happened with housing and with banks, okay? In 2007, large banking corporations began to lose money on something called they were called subprime mortgages. So what a bank does when you borrow money is they check your credit. You've probably heard of credit scores before. You have to have good credit in order to get a loan, typically because a credit score is a way that the bank measures your ability to pay your bills and to pay your debts. If you have a good record of paying off your debt, you tend to have good credit. But if you've, say, missed payments or defaulted on a loan or you just don't make enough money, typically banks won't loan you money because it's not a prime mortgage or a prime auto loan or whatever, okay? But a subprime mortgage is giving those people with bad credit a chance, okay? You may have bad credit, but I'm going to give you a chance, okay, buddy? That's what the banks were doing. And they were charging pretty good interest rates. They were making some money off of this. And as long as the economy was going well, things were okay. But By 2007, 2008, a lot of people had bought these massive homes that they couldn't afford, and they couldn't afford the payments on their homes, and they start defaulting on their mortgages. And banks all across the country start veering on the edge of collapse. Mortgages are a huge industry in the financial sector, okay? Loans that people pay for their homes are responsible. It's a huge source of income. And so the United States tries to save the banks as big banks start to collapse. If banks start to fail, like the big banks, then the little banks that borrow money from the big banks, they'll fail too. And then businesses that borrow money from those banks will fail. And then people who work for those businesses that are failing, they'll start to lose their jobs. So it looks like it's going to be another Great Depression. So the U.S. government does not want another Great Depression. So we try to act fast. We spend $1.5 trillion buying those bad loans from the banks and bailing out the failing banks to keep them from sinking. This housing crisis affects the whole economy because housing is such a huge part of the economy. Think about it. Every time someone builds a house, you create jobs. You've got construction jobs, people that build the frames, people that lay the foundation, but then you've also got other jobs like, the air conditioning, the windows, the painting, the furniture, okay? All sorts of businesses, the kitchen implements, the home depots, all these places that depend upon home construction. All of a sudden, their work starts to slow down. People aren't buying new houses anymore because nobody's able to get loans. All the banks are starting to go out of business. The economy starts slowing down. And when the carpenter loses his job, he's not going to go to a restaurant and buy a steak dinner. So then that restaurant's going to start losing money. They're going to have to lay off their workers and so on and so forth. And it turns into a really bad cycle, but it got worse because the housing crisis was followed by large automobile manufacturers nearly failing as well. Automobile car manufacturers like Chrysler and General Motors, they were starting to run out of business. They were producing these big, huge gas-guzzling cars that costed thousands and thousands of dollars. And all of a sudden, people didn't want to buy them anymore because the economy is tanking. You're not going to go out and buy a brand new car and make these massive payments on it if you can't even pay your home loan. And so people had spent too much money, and now they couldn't pay off their debt, so they're not going to start taking on more debt to buy these fancy cars. And if the car companies go out of business, then you're losing a huge amount of jobs. Think about all the people that work in Ford auto companies or the Chrysler or General Motors, all these people that are making cars and all these car manufacturers, if they lose their jobs, you're going to have millions of people unemployed eventually because you're going to see their spending goes down, which then affects the businesses that they buy stuff from, and it just rolls its way through the economy. So the U.S. government bails out the auto industry as well, giving them lots and lots of money just to keep the doors open. These general economic woes and stagnation led to an economic recession that was blamed on George Bush. And this happens in 2008. Back in 2004, he was really popular and he had won re-election. So George Bush served 2 terms, unlike his dad who only served 1 term. But at the end of his presidency, the economy is going really badly. And so a lot of people who are tired of the long war on terrorism in the Middle East, they were tired of the economic recession in the United States, and they were tired in general of inequality in the U.S. society. They looked towards a young Democratic candidate who promised to bring change, and that was Barack Obama. Barack Obama wins the presidency in 2008. We're not going to talk a whole lot about him because, again, this is such recent history. I don't really feel like it is fair to analyze him until we have more context. But just a brief overview, Clinton and Bush and Obama all share the characteristic of being a partisan president. Clinton, Bush, and Obama are all popular with their own parties for the most part, but hated by the other. And this pattern seems to have continued with Donald Trump. The last 4 presidents that we've had have tended to be very partisan. They are loved by Republicans. Let's say if you're a Republican president like George Bush or Donald Trump, they tend to be really loved by Republicans, but hated by Democrats. Democratic presidents like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, Democrats love them, Republicans hate them. The last president that we had that really had broad appeal to both sides was Ronald Reagan. Okay, Ronald Reagan was the last president to have a slam dunk win in the presidential votes, like in 1984, when Ronald Reagan won 49 out of the 50 states. So not since 1984 have we had a president that both sides kind of liked, okay? When you win 49 out of the 50 states, you're a pretty popular president. We haven't had a really, really popular president since 1984, and so that was nearly 30 years ago, okay? So for the past 30 years, our presidents have been either all Republican or all Democrat. And so Obama was a very popular president with Democrats, but was very unpopular with Republicans. Barack Obama was successfully able to end the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. He brought American soldiers home, but he was critiqued for leaving behind unstable countries. The United States wanted out, so we left, and we left a mess. And so Afghanistan and Iraq today are still picking up the pieces from those long wars in their countries. And Iraq particularly faced a lot of instability with the creation of ISIS, this Islamic government, this extremist Islamic government that tried to install Sharia law all across the Middle East. And ISIS has, for the most part, been defeated, but they're still hanging on in certain parts of Iraq and Syria and that place. And, you know, that part of the Middle East, they're still hanging on just barely. And it's largely because of the United States kind of we went in, got rid of Saddam Hussein, we scrambled up the country, and then we left without finishing the job. So we kind of created a monster. Barack Obama's major social policy was healthcare reform and immigration reform. He was instrumental in passing the Affordable Health Care Act, which requires Americans to get health insurance and, you know, gets rid of some of the restrictions that prevented people from getting health insurance. And so that program is still affecting us today, even though in the Donald Trump presidency, a lot of the Affordable Health Care Act was overturned. A lot of it is still on the books today. So it's kind of lingering on. And, you know, in some regards, it's led to more people having a lot more people have insurance now, but people with insurance are facing higher and higher prices for their insurance. So, you know, there are some positive and negative aspects of it. With immigration reform, he had to deal with increased numbers of illegal and legal immigration to the United States. And Barack Obama took a more softer stance on immigration, even though Barack Obama actually deported way more illegal immigrants than George Bush did. Barack Obama also created programs to help what they call the dreamers, the young immigrants who are brought into the United States as children. And there's a lot of things that Barack Obama did to try to help illegal immigrants out and legal immigrants as well. And a lot of that has been overturned by our current president. But again, this is why it's kind of hard to talk about history, because we don't know what's going to happen with all these policies in the next few years. So it would be better to hold our historical judgment until later. So as we finish up our discussion of American history, I'd like to kind of wrap things up, okay? The United States has changed quite a lot since the beginning of this class. Remember when we first started, we were talking about the Gilded Age and Reconstruction after the Civil War. How much different is the United States today than we were back in the 1870s? Try to leave a comment below and tell me, what do you think? What do you think is the biggest way that America has changed since the 1870s? Go ahead and leave a comment and let me know what you think. Listen, everyone, I'm really appreciative of you watching these videos, and I know that it's not the same as us being in person, but it has actually been really beneficial for me to get to hear from y'all and talk to y'all with email, with on the phone and through these comments. If you need anything, please let me know, okay? Try to get your work packets done. Try it for you guys in the college class. Make sure you get your final papers done, and your college and honors people, get your tests done and send them in to me as soon as you can. For those of you in the regular history class, get your packets done and let me know if you need any help. And I really do appreciate y'all. I hate that we're not together, but I hope to see you all very soon. So thank you. I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of this year. And thank you for all that y'all have been doing and all the hard work that you've been doing today in this whole semester. Anyways, I appreciate y'all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Goodbye.